Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of this lecture. In the first part of lecture 16, we really talked about how public policy helps inform systems change, and make sure you have a good understanding of the interactive relationship between public policy and practice. And at the end of part 1, I informed you guys of an extra credit discussion opportunity regarding person first language. There will be some information about some just different resources you guys can look at, and I'll give you guys a prompt that you guys can have a discussion with each other about. But now we're going to get into education and really talk about where we've come with education for individuals with disabilities, and specifically individuals with intellectual disabilities. So in the past, individuals with intellectual disabilities we know have suffered discrimination due to societal views, court decisions, and legislation. Um, we've talked about Brown versus Board of Education, and so remember, Brown versus Board of Education really set the stage for increased educational opportunities and served as a major legal turning point in the lives of people with intellectual disabilities. Because what it did is it was established that separate is inherently unequal. So giving someone, saying, well, you can have this own school for individuals with disabilities. If they don't have access to the same things as their non-disabled peers, that's not equal. And while Brown versus Board of Education was about race, it still really helped lay the groundwork for future legislation. So legal bases for establishing rights. The main legal basis we want to look at here is the 14th Amendment. And the Due Process Clause guarantees no person should be deprived of life, liberty, or property without going through proper legal channels. Additionally, the 14th Amendment says that allows people equal protection under the law. So this means that minority groups, and that includes any minority group, and this includes individuals with disabilities, are afforded the same rights as the majority. So individuals without disabilities, specifically in our case. And when we're looking at what are actual rights when we're talking about education, we know individuals with disabilities have a right to access to an education. They have a right to appropriate evaluation and classification. They have a right to a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE, how it'll be referred to. They also have right to the least restrictive environment and appropriate placement. And when we talk about least restrictive environment, or the LRE, this is really when we talk about inclusion. So individuals don't necessarily have a right to inclusion. It's a policy that's been adapted out of the understanding or the educational right to being educated in the least restrictive environment and having an appropriate placement based on your disability. There's also a right to related services, and these include things like transportation, medical services when necessary, psychological services. Also a right to extended school year and certain disciplinary provisions if they're needed as a result of having their disability. So it's important to note when we're talking about access to education, there's no federal constitutional right to an education. The right to education was established through litigation. And again, when you're thinking back through earlier in part 1, when we talk about that interactive relationship between public policy and practice, this is what we're talking about through litigation. So people didn't agree. Society didn't agree with how people with disabilities were being treated, which then helped inform public policy and practice. And it continues to even get better. And in this lecture, we'll talk about some new legislation that's helped to set some groundwork in regards to access. Successful litigation was based on the argument that if education is provided to the public in general, then it should be available to all children, regardless of their level of ability or type of impairment. So again, there's no federal constitutional right to education, but because it's available to all people, then it also should be available to individuals with disabilities. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about some legislative mandates that helped establish individual educational rights. And so a huge one that's really important to look at is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, or IDEA, or Public Law 92-142. And this was formerly known as the Education of All Handicapped Children Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this ensures that all students have access to FAPE, that free, appropriate public education. And it also provides procedural safeguards for ensuring educational rights to all students, regardless of their disability. So when we're looking at educational outcomes, and again, this outcome-based assessment, we want to make sure we're looking at the least restrictive environment. And it's important to note that the least restrictive environment is only given to the maximum extent appropriate. And again, that term is pretty broad. And again, this is often referred to as the mainstreaming policy. And again, a free, appropriate public education needs to be taken into account when determining a student's least restrictive environment. And generally in courts, FAPE, or a free, appropriate public education, has been interpreted as superseding LRE, or the least restrictive environment. And what that means is that FAPE is most important. So whenever there's a question about can the student have access to a free, appropriate publication or a least or a less restrictive environment, FAPE is going to supersede that in most cases. So I mentioned a little bit that when talking about inclusion. So inclusion refers to the mandate that when appropriate, students with disabilities receive their education in the regular classroom with their non-disabled peers and are provided access to the general education curriculum. Like I mentioned, inclusion is nowhere in IDEA or its implementing regulations. IDEA addresses the concept of inclusion through the term least restrictive environment, or LRE. So the least restrictive environment is the legal standard by which inclusion decisions are made. And full inclusion is not always the least restrictive environment for every student with a disability. And it's just important to kind of think about the pros and cons of inclusion. Critics of inclusion question its value in situations when it results in a student's isolation in a regular classroom or unfairly takes away from the educational resources of regular education students in the classroom. Because inclusion doesn't meet the individual needs of all students. Many students' needs cannot be addressed in an inclusive setting. I've worked in some situations where students, specifically with an intellectual disability, in a full inclusion model, meaning that they're in the general education classroom all day, aren't having access to FAPE because they need more individualized instruction. Now, does that mean you pull them out? Nope. The least restrictive environment is a continuum. So when appropriate, it might be good to pull them out to help fill some gaps, or in a more progressive model, hopefully, whenever possible, have a special educator push in to provide some specialized instruction so they can access the general education curriculum. Again, advocates of inclusion argue that the socialization and stigma of reducing impact of inclusion outweigh any drawbacks of inclusion. So everyone, disabled and non-disabled peers, must kind of learn to function together in society. And we know that inclusion increases the understanding of disabilities among those that don't have disabilities. And I've certainly seen that also occur in so many different instances where a student with an intellectual disability or another type of disability is pretty close to being in a full inclusion model, and the other students really benefit from learning, tolerance and understanding and acceptance and how to work together with others that may not be like them. So there's no perfect answer, but still, when we're looking at this legally, the least restrictive environment has to be taken into account, and to the greatest extent possible that they're able to also have a benefit from their education. Students with disabilities should receive their education with non-disabled peers. So looking at this again, this is just from the actual law. So It's important that every child with a disability has a right and it should be entitled to be placed in a general education class full time if they can benefit from their education. Um, and also, again, we also, again, need to make sure that we also do consider the rights of non-disabled peers. But again, it's a balancing act is the bottom line. And it absolutely should, no one should make a unilateral decision about an individual's least restrictive environment. A special education team that includes special educators, regular educators, other related service professionals, school psychologists, parents, families need to be included in making this decision. All right, so now we're going to talk about some really critical pieces of education that allowed just access. So just allowed individuals with intellectual disabilities through the door. And the Park case is really, really groundbreaking in that it established a precedent guaranteeing access to publicly supported education for all students with intellectual disabilities. Again, this publicly supported piece is important because I'm going to explain this while I'm going to show you guys a video. There are, and there have been special schools available for students with intellectual disabilities or other disabilities. But again, we want to make sure that there is, that students with disabilities have access to publicly supported education. So their families don't have to pay money to allow them education. And the Park case was really groundbreaking in that. So I'm going to show you this video that kind of explains it.
This is the story of Jack Adams and his son Bobby in the Park versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania court case.
Hi everyone, my name is Jack Adams and I'm from the small town of Warren, Pennsylvania. I have a wife, Mary, and 2 children, Bobby and Bella, and this is the story of how my son Bobby persevered and overcame all odds, changing schooling in Pennsylvania for children of the future. Back in 1971, Bobby was just 8 years old, entering the 3rd grade. Mary and I went to register him from school, but something I never expected happened. The school turned us away, refusing to teach and help Bobby. Bobby's teacher said that
Pennsylvania state law allows public schools to deny services to children who have not attained a mental age of 5 years by the start of the 1st grade or of the age of 8.
Bobby was going into 3rd grade and still had trouble forming words, let alone reading them. Bobby's teacher said he was always behind, but we never imagined the school would refuse to teach him altogether just because of his disability. How was he supposed to learn if no one would teach him? Frustrated and upset, my wife and I knew we had to do something about the situation. After hearing similar stories about this happening to other families, we formed the Pennsylvania chapter of the Association of Retarded Children, also known as PART. In 1971, we brought the seminal lawsuit, Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the first right to education suit in the country, to overturn that Pennsylvania law and secure quality education for all children. As parents, we were arguing 3 main points. First, all children with mental retardation are capable of benefiting from education and training. Second, education cannot be defined as the only provision of academic experiences for children. And third, the earlier these students with mental retardation are afforded an education, the greater the amount of learning that could be predicted. After several debates and arguments, the court's order was made and final. 3 major changes were made to Pennsylvania schools. School districts were required to identify and start teaching all children with mental retardation. School districts were to develop evaluation programs for the most appropriate placement of the children, and on top of that, the State Department of Education was required to submit plans describing available programs, financial arrangements, and teacher recruitment and training efforts to provide education. Mary and I were thrilled that we were able to not only help out Bobby, but all the children of Pennsylvania who are going through the same thing as well. There's not a day that goes by that Bobby doesn't thank me for what we did for him. We truly made a difference that year, and Pennsylvania schools will forever be changed because of it.
All right, so really important that you guys know this Park case because, again, it really laid the groundwork for establishing a precedent that individuals with intellectual disabilities have a right to a publicly supported education. Continuing thinking about access, later on in the late 80s, in the Timothy versus Rochester School District case, a federal district court decided that the rights guaranteed under IDEA did not apply if the child could not benefit from special education. This was overturned because then it stated that a student with significant disabilities didn't need to demonstrate an ability to benefit from special education to be eligible for those services. And this idea of benefit and making progress will continue now. And we'll talk about a really recent piece of legislation. But I think it's worth a pause here to think about, what do you guys think benefit is? And should someone have to show benefit in order to have access to something? And if that's the case, then should that also, how does that apply to individuals without disabilities as well? Should they have to show a benefit in order to have access to education? All right, now looking at critical litigation in the area of evaluation and classification. In the Hobson and Hansen case, the court found that students were being tracked into these ability groups based on instruments, so cognitive assessments that were biased against African Americans and those from lower SES backgrounds. And so again, there was a disproportionately number of children from low SES backgrounds and students that were African American that were in these classrooms for children with severe intellectual disability. Schools in the District of Columbia were no longer permitted to use IQ measures to place children on tracks into these different classes. Looking again further at this is the PACE case when we're looking at evaluation and classification. This is again the use of IQ tests to put minority students in classes for mild intellectual disability or mild mental retardation, as it was referred to at the time, were again called into question. The court declared that the tests were non-discriminatory and the practices valid when additional measures were also used. The court looked specifically at the tests. In fact, there was found to be no racial bias, but it also was shown that the practices as a whole were discriminatory against minority groups. Now looking at some critical legislation as it applies to FAPE, or that free appropriate public education. So the Board of Education of the Hendrick Hudson School District versus Rowley, this was the first case argued before the Supreme Court on the basis of Public Law 94-142. And the court's interpretation of congressional intent in enacting this suggested that programs are expected to provide educational benefits, but they don't have to develop students to their maximum potential. In this case, up until, again, I'm going to talk about some breaking news, a new case just out of Colorado this couple months ago. That was the first case that really redefined this whole idea. Because what we used to always say in special education, which was never great, or I didn't particularly care for, I know a lot of others didn't as well, was, well, we just have to do something. We don't have to develop students to their maximum potential. And the reason for this wasn't necessarily that folks didn't want to give people their best. And in most cases, most of the time in working in special education, people always went above and beyond to really help develop students to their maximum potential, but school districts were not legally obligated to do so. But in this new case, in the Andrew F. case, this dealt with a 17-year-old student with autism in Colorado, so not too far from us. And the student was not making adequate progress towards their social and emotional goals. And so what happened was the parents took him out of that school and put him in a private school, and the student began making amazing progress immediately. And so, again, what we looked at here is that the student must show significant educational progress, even in light of their circumstances. And this, again, includes individuals with autism that may have behavioral difficulties. So we see this redefined now. So what the court ruled is that you cannot providing merely more than the minimus or just the minimum, that's not enough. Schools must provide an educational program reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. So this means that schools can't just provide the bare minimum legally. And again, like I said, in most cases that I've worked with, thankfully, schools were going above and beyond. But now it's law that more than the minimum must be provided. And so again, reflect back from a second to part one when you're thinking about the interactive relationship between public policy and practice. Basic practice was that people were in general providing more. That helped inform public policy, our society, inputs on a societal level, and our understanding of disability, and that people can, do more. That really helped change this law. And now it's law. You have to provide more. So again, this is just an example of, again, how various inputs from social inputs, our change in understanding of disability and autism really helped inform public policy and now practice, and then ultimately outcomes for individuals with disabilities. So again, looking more at some critical legislation, specifically when we're talking about LRE, or remember that's the least restrictive environment. In the Sacramento City Board of Education versus Rachel, the court fashioned a 4-pronged test to determine LRE. And the first one is that you must consider the educational benefits to the student, and additionally the non-academic benefits. And this is a big one. This is also social, emotional type benefits. You also have to consider the effect of the student's presence on the general education teacher and their students, and then also the cost of having the student with a disability in the general education classroom. And what this means is that these things must be considered when determining an individual's least restrictive environment. So some critical legislation as it applies to related services. So related services are extra things that are needed to help carry out an individual's special education programming. And these are things we're going to talk about: transportation. So in the Hurry case and the Alamo Heights School District case, it was determined that transportation to and from school is a related service. So I want you guys maybe to think a little bit about, why is transportation a related service? Why does someone need to have specialized transportation in some cases in order to implement their IEP? And if you think about individuals with intellectual disability, there could be some reasons where a school bus with lots of other students may not be appropriate for them and maybe make it more difficult for them. Additionally, if certain schools within a school district have better programming for individuals with intellectual disabilities, maybe they need additional transportation to maybe go a little bit further to get access to that. And that is certainly not exhaustive, but transportation is a related service. In the TG case, it was also determined that psychological services is a related service. So having access to counseling and a school psychologist, in some cases, depending on someone's disability, is a service that should be covered by the school district to help implement a student's individualized education plan. And in the McKenzie case, it's important to note that if this is looking at residential placements, so placement in a residential facility is medical, not educational in nature, and doesn't have to be paid for by a school district unless a school district recommends it. And the school district determines that that's the most appropriate place for that child, and there's not any other available services in their school district where the student can be receive educational benefit. All right, so some critical legislation surrounding extended school year. So what is extended school year? So in some cases, students with individualized education plans or IEPs that are receiving special education can go to summer school essentially, but the summer school is specifically tailored to their IEP. And in the Armstrong case, what was found or what was established was that summer breaks in educational programs of certain students could cause loss or huge regression in skill, and it could take too long to recoup that skill the following school year for them to continue to make adequate progress. So the courts found that the policy of limiting educational services to a maximum of 180 days to be inflexible, and thus it can prevent some students from receiving FAPE. So in some cases, when it's shown that a child can have regression in skills after long breaks, they can have access to extended school year. This has to be backed up by data, and that data can be taken over like spring break or Christmas break to see if there's regression in skill. So just a really quick and kind of dirty way to explain how special education works as a whole. So a child is identified as needing special ed or related services. The child is evaluated. Eligibility is decided by an IEP team. Again, it's not a unilateral decision. The child is found eligible then, and then an IEP meeting is scheduled, and then the meeting is held, and if everyone agrees, the IEP is written, services are provided, progress is measured and reported to parents on a regular basis. The IEP is reviewed annually, and the child is reevaluated every 3 years. That's a very, very, very quick, hitting the high points, kind of simple way to explain it. This is something, again, I do a lot in my profession. So if anyone ever has questions about how this process works, I work a lot with parents as an advocate as well, so I'm happy to answer any further questions. But this just provides you guys with an overall understanding of how things work when a child receives special education. When we're looking at an individualized education plan or an IEP, these are the essential elements. So strengths, you need to talk about, again, it's really important you guys know from a support planning perspective that strengths are utilized to help remediate difficulties. It's also really important to outline really specifically, objectively, what areas the child needs help in. So if an individual has an intellectual disability, what are the adaptive behavior difficulties they have and what do they need? What are the cognitive difficulties they have and what do they need? And then goals and sometimes objectives are written. Goals are typically written for 1 year, and they need to be data driven and really objective as well. They need to be measurable and specific. And then also the who, what, where, when, and why. The why is because they qualified for special ed needs to be outlined. So who the service providers are, how much time it's gonna take, what, how many days a week, and so on and so forth. Also, any accommodations, and accommodations are things that, again, allow a child access predominantly. These are things like maybe possibly the use of a paraprofessional, maybe a positive behavior support plan that's specifically tailored, preferential seating, testing at certain times a day, testing accommodations. Accommodations are what you see. This is the piece that a 504 takes care of too. So sometimes when students kind of graduate out of or grow out of an IEP or no longer necessitate specialized instruction, they may receive accommodations through a Section 504 plan. And that's nice because that can also carry on with them into college and in some other situations. And then related services like transportation, psychological services that we talked about. And then just some further considerations for students with intellectual disability. Thinking about the use of instructional technology. And this, again, the goal is to provide instruction or aims to teach a skill via technology. And this doesn't necessarily have to be like a computer, but what type of instructional technologies are available to help students with intellectual disabilities. Assistive technology, this can be the use of an iPad, FM devices, amplification devices, anything kind of aid or specific equipment that they need to access their curriculum. Positive behavior supports, which we've talked a lot about, and this is, really looking at examining our antecedents and the structure of environments and teaching skills and focusing on what people are doing correctly and positively reinforcing those. And then blended curriculum. And this is when academic and functional life skills are combined. And they must have content individualized in both areas. It's really important that we don't just focus on functional or life skills, but that we also build academic competencies in individuals with intellectual disabilities. So that was a rundown of some really important educational considerations, specifically in the special education realm, and rights that have been established to help really inform how we can make things better and how things have gotten better for individuals with disabilities and intellectual disabilities in the education realm. Again, as a practicing school psychologist, I deal with a lot of this stuff, or all of this stuff on a pretty regular basis. So if anyone is interested or wants more information about special education and how that works, reach out, let me know. I'm happy to discuss any of this stuff further with you. Thanks for your attention, and we will see you guys later.